All right, folks, we're going to get started. Welcome to Stop LAPD Spying Coalition's third Tuesday of the month webinar. This is our general meeting. My name is Hamid Khan with the Stop LAPD Spying Coalition. I go by he, him. If you've been attending our previous webinars, welcome back. If you're new to it, well, we appreciate you joining us. So real quickly, we've been holding these webinars in lieu of in-person meetings, which we were based out of Skid Row in downtown Los Angeles. And for many years, we've been meeting every Tuesday, holding our meetings with the community, in the community. And when COVID hit, starting in March, we had to really just pivot and go online just out of respect for everyone's health and safety. So today is our 47th webinar, which means that since March 20th, I believe, of last year, we've been holding a webinar every Tuesday. We may have missed maybe a couple Tuesdays here and there, but today is webinar 47. And these webinars are also themed as well, while the coalition as an abolitionist organization is about surveillance, spying, and infiltration. But we also look at how it intersects with our daily lives. So the first Tuesday is committed to holding a webinar and conversations, how the national security police state intersects with the gender and sexuality. The second Tuesday of the month is committed to how the national security police state intersects with the impact on youth, the war on youth that has been going on. The third Tuesday, which would be today, is more like looking at the political landscape, what's out there, what's happening on the regular. And the fourth Tuesday is looking at the police state and the data-driven policing. So today is, of course, our third Tuesday, and we're super happy to have with us a couple of awesome guests. Just a quick logistical thing, many of you who have joined us, your mics were muted, and for the only reason that we have been Zoom bombed. We just got Zoom bombed just last Tuesday, so not trying to police anybody's comment, but definitely would love to have folks join the conversation. If you have any comment to make or question to ask or anything to say, you have the raise hand, function in there too, or send a message and the chat is only open to the host as well. So send us a message, but during the course of this conversation, we will also see if we can unmute everybody, and then because we want this to be an interactive, a collective conversation. But to get started, I want to welcome two of our guests. We're going to spend some time having a conversation with them, Yarden Katz, and I'm going to let them, when they go, introduce themselves real briefly, and then we can circle back. And Craig Roberts, who's also a member of the coordinating team and one of the leaders of the coalition, and also one of the organizers in the Skid Row community. But so maybe Yarden, if real quickly, if you want to introduce yourself, and then I'll go to Craig.
Yes, thanks for having me. My name is Yarden, and I'm a postdoc at Harvard, and I study history, politics of science. Very interested in militarism, resistance to militarism, and white supremacy.
Thank you and welcome. Craig, do you want to take a second to introduce yourself?
Yeah, my name is Craig Roberts, and I'm a 17-year resident of Skid Row, and a member of the Stop LAPD Spying Coalition, as well as the Los Angeles Community Action Network, LA CAN. I'm an organizer of the homeless and the powerless to try to empower them to take control of their own lives as vis-a-vis the national security surveillance police state.
Excellent, thank you. Well, let's dive right into it. So let's start with you, Yarden. So if you could let's start with what the heck is artificial intelligence? I mean, we always thought that human intelligence is as natural as it gets. So where does the artificial came in, and when did it come in, and what the heck is going on?
Yeah. Okay. Should I start? Should I share a screen and stuff?
Please, however you want to talk about it.
So I have a couple of slides that I wanted to share with all of you. So thanks very much for having me. Just wanted to say I really admire the work that this group does, And I learned so much from your activism, from your reports, from your thinking. As I was saying earlier, before you all came in, it's a real contrast to what you normally see in academia, which is very complicit, as you know, with imperialism, with state power, with policing. So it's really an honor to be here, and I wish this was in person. So Hamid asked me to talk about artificial intelligence and what it is, and it's a very messy topic, it turns out, as you alluded to, and I recently wrote a book on it, which goes into it in detail. And if you're interested in a copy, just email me. So what is artificial intelligence? Is there a way to stop this buzzing? Does anybody know?
I can turn it off. Yeah, I'll turn it off.
Okay, great. I'm having technical. Sorry for us that are, not good with computers, even though we study artificial intelligence. How do I move the bar at the top? Does anybody know?
So we don't see the bar, so we can see the title at the top.
Okay, great, fantastic. Okay, so what is artificial intelligence? It turns out this is a tricky question to answer because the concept has always been kind of nebulous and shifting and contradictory. And any decision made with a computer can be labeled AI in the right context. And my point is that this is kind of a feature, not a bug of the whole thing, that AI's shifting character has made it a very flexible vehicle for imperialist and capitalist projects. And historically, AI has also served as a kind of racial science, producing essentially models of human nature that reaffirm and elevate white male supremacy. And so my broader argument, and which you'll see throughout, is that AI as a concept and as a set of practices both serves a society based on white supremacy by serving its agendas, but that it also mimics kind of racial ideology and whiteness in form by being nebulous, shifting, yet always serving a basic set of imperialist and capitalist interests. And for this, I draw on the work of many writers about white supremacy, notably Cedric Robinson, who argued that racial regimes, like societies based on racial hierarchies, depend on what he called a makeshift patchwork. They draw on science when it's needed to say this group is better than that one. They draw on art, on mythology, and fictions in order to justify exploitation and domination. And these racial regimes are dynamic things because they're constantly being contested by social movements and they have to adapt to changing conditions. So my point is that the regime of AI, if you will, is like whiteness, is like a racial regime in that it's a fiction that's always changing, but it has real and devastating consequences. So when I say it's a fiction, I'm not discounting the real effects. Okay, so let's go back to the beginning. The term AI was coined in 1956. The people who coined it were working in the military-industrial complex. It's a quintessentially Cold War product. It grew out of psychology and computing, which were both fields entangled with war and the projects of racialization through things like mental testing and IQ testing. And AI's notion of intelligence was always based on what are tasks that are useful to the military and useful to capitalist management, because that's those were the things that interested that elite white world. So for example, some of the early, so-called pioneers of AI based their model of intelligence on what would make for a good control of an air defense system. So what would be the ultimate human operator who would know how to dispatch interceptor aircrafts to thwart an attack from the enemy? They use that as their basis. And this was all work done in collaboration with the US Air Force. These same practitioners who became very prominent generated an enormous amount of propaganda that is still with us today. They said in 1958, we now have machines in the world that think, that learn, that create, and these machines would soon surpass human capacities. And they made these outlandish predictions, like within a decade, it'll basically be like a human mind. In reality, their notion of intelligence was, of course, extremely narrow, based on what's useful to the military or on narrow problem-solving tasks that their milieu sort of valued, like playing chess. And the empirical validation of these models were always based on these very select groups of kind of affluent, white male subjects. This circle of practitioners also, you can look at their work and you can see that they were always trying to order society, to rank it. They came up with models of ranking individuals, ranking societies, saying student is on top, then worker, then hippie. We have US culture, then French, then Chinese. And they always thought in these racialized hierarchical terms, much like other racial sciences like biology, like psychology. And so AI should be seen as part of that kind of racial science apparatus. That being said, AI practitioners made incredibly outrageous claims, and that led to a lot of tension with adjacent fields like economics and psychology, which were also in the business of sort of offering these hierarchical models of human nature. And so sometimes AI was under attack by scientists, by philosophers, people within, people from outside the field, saying it's a con trick, it's a way to raise money, it's the least self-critical field in the world, and so forth. But what bound this endeavor together is the cozy alliance of the AI field from the very beginning with the Pentagon and with professional experts, with universities. And that gave the field this superficial sense of coherence, like this is a coherent scientific project, and it's going to bulldoze over society. And I'll get back to that when we talk about the present. So AI practitioners, researchers allied themselves with empire by constantly reminding or saying that if we don't invest in AI, if we, the imperial, we do not invest in AI, we will lose our hegemony. So for instance, this is a book from very famous AI practitioners and a journalist in the 1980s that said, we have to invest in a national program for AI right now, because otherwise the Japanese are going to beat us. And they use this incredibly racist imagery and rhetoric to sort of drum up support from the political establishment. You can see here the cover of their book. You have this Japanese feminine figure colonizing the body of Libertas, which is, standing here for kind of like the Western white woman. And so AI was presented as like this, masculine force that's going to defend the purity of the white woman. And it's rehashing all of these horribly racist tropes about Asian Americans, about generally racist tropes from the history of white supremacy. And this has been a constant theme. So sort of, we need to do this, otherwise the Japanese, otherwise the Chinese, otherwise whoever will take away our global superpower. In addition, AI has also served as a kind of pretext and vehicle for neoliberal agendas and for economic projects of restructuring society. So from the very early days, AI was referred to as a kind of super slave, literally referred to as a slave that would basically free all of us from human labor by generating wealth, and it would do all the things that we don't want to do and more. But in order to unleash that power, we would have to basically neoliberalize society. So for example, we shouldn't cut taxes for corporations because that would hurt innovation and that would hurt AI and so forth. And so a lot of times AI is just a pretext for those very familiar neoliberal agendas. And there's a whole slew of books that basically do this. It's like Milton Friedman, with the packaging being AI. Okay, so as I mentioned at the outset, these kinds of racial regimes and racial ideologies have to adapt to resistance and to changing times. And so I want to talk about one recent adaptation of AI in our present moment. So in the mid-2010s, roughly, the term AI sort of reappeared again in the mainstream in a major way, unlike ever before, I would say. So here I'm plotting the number of occurrences in kind of corporate US media of the terms artificial intelligence and big data. And you see that in the mid 2010s, you have this huge peak of AI right after big data was already in kind of mainstream usage. People were already all the time talking about big data. And this shift to AI was noticed even by software company CEOs. They're like, oh, wait, all of a sudden everybody's talking about AI. So why? So I want to suggest that there's a political reason for this shift, one of several. One recall is that in the mid 2000s, in the 2010s, and in June 2013, Edward Snowden leaked some important revelations about the vastness of the surveillance state, and this helped catalyze worldwide protests. At the time, this led to kind of pretty mainstream disillusionment with Silicon Valley companies who were shown to be complicit with the national security state through programs like PRISM. And it sort of kind of ruined a little bit this big data ideology that we're going to govern the world through big data. Big data is a panacea. And the rise of AI sort of followed this shift, and the introduction of AI played an important role temporarily to distract from surveillance, because now the media could talk about, it could recycle these cliches about robots, and it could talk about the limits of the human mind and what are we anyway, are we just machines, and distract from all of these things. And so it sort of gussied up the old projects of big data, which were continuing, but they were just continuing under a new label. So the epitome of this is when in May 2018, Google Research renamed itself Google AI. But what takes place inside, and the basic agendas, the basic players are all exactly the same. And so this creation, this staging of the age of AI depends on several factors working together. It depends on corporations, which are of course dominating the discourses on computing and on AI. It depends on the nonprofit industrial complex, on think tanks, academics, policy professionals who are in many ways funded by these corporations and funded by the state to sort of be there to interpret AI, to write their white papers, policy proposals about how to manage AI. And they did that very obediently. They just embraced it. You have corporate media, which are recycling the propaganda claims of the corporations. And of course, you have the Pentagon and the national security state to sort of fund this whole thing and help to steer it. And so pretty much overnight, you had the rise of this AI expert industry, everybody rushing to interpret AI and to explain its relevance. And the ideological core of this expert industry is that AI is a coherent and revolutionary technology. It's enabled by better computing and better data. It's reshaping all of society, and it's exceeding or soon will exceed the capacities of the human mind. And the second, I'd say, core item is that it must be managed urgently. And how is it going to be managed? It's going to be managed by more partnerships with these so-called stakeholders. So it's kind of neoliberal model. Let's all sit together at the table, Google, the Pentagon, academics, and we'll all sort of work it out. But the old agenda, the old sort of utopian visions of AI creating wealth for everyone and all that old stuff from the 80s and before couldn't just be exactly reproduced, because times have changed, and so social movements have made gains, and so this new wave of AI had to make some sort of reference to inequality, even social justice, to racism, sexism, and so forth. And so what the companies have done is they've rolled out these so-called ethical AI initiatives, or funded by the state and funded by major corporations and billionaires, to say we're going to build ethical AI for the benefit of everyone. And there's a huge contrast between the sort of fluffy, nebulous ethical AI initiative, we're just going to do good for everyone, and the really harmful colonialist agendas of many of the donors and sponsors of these things. And maybe we can circle back to that later, but I just wanted to point to that agenda, the difference between the image and the reality. This AI industry, again, because of the gains made by social movements, I would say also had to have a kind of progressive wing. So you still have the, the Pentagon, experts going around saying we need AI to defeat China, but you also have a front that is sort of apparently more tuned to issues of social justice. So for instance, there's this project called Gender Shades, which tried to claim that AI is biased in terms of race and gender. And what these researchers did is that they measured the bias for, say, the misrecognition, I would say, of, let's say, photographs of Black women in the software of various companies like Microsoft and Google and so forth. And they showed that it misrecognizes or actually doesn't recognize these so-called intersectional categories, like a photograph of a woman who is Black. And it called for correcting this bias. And so even though it framed things as a social justice project, sort of invoking concepts like intersectionality, in practice, it offers a really concrete way to extend the carceral eye, to include in your set of recognized photographs Black women, but to do it all with a kind of progressive veneer. And this work was funded by corporations like Microsoft. Unsurprisingly, corporations and governments have embraced this bias framework completely. So, for instance, Google has preyed on Black folks in Atlanta in the name of collecting, more racially diverse data sets for their products. Similarly, in the West Bank, in Palestine, an Israeli company backed by Microsoft has claimed that they're making great strides in making their product less biased in terms of race and gender. So this bias framework obviously doesn't challenge the carceral state. Nonetheless, the establishment and the kind of the nonprofits in this space had to adapt to a real social movement, which was saying, we don't want this facial recognition crap here. We want to ban it altogether. And so the experts then had to change their tune. And so there was some support for the ban, but I want to point out that this only goes so far. So prominent nonprofits like the EFF, for instance, Electronic Frontier Foundation, said, oh, we are concerned about the so-called amplification of carceral bias, but they still cling on to this idea of emerging technologies like AI and the need to promote innovation. They, of course, don't name or challenge the prison industrial complex, and they leave it all up at the end of the day to individual rights and privacy laws. So this is just, quintessential liberalism. The other point I want to make is that this so-called, progressive wing of the corporate academic AI expert industry also does the bidding of its sponsors. So for instance, AI Now, which is a think tank that is funded by Google and Microsoft, their founder went on social media praising Microsoft for its decision to ostensibly not sell facial recognition software to police. But this was just a publicity stunt because Microsoft, of course, has a whole suite of prison management software, of policing software, which it sells to police departments all around the world, not just in the US. And it's deeply involved with the Israeli army, with Israeli police, and so forth. And so this was just a PR tactic in a way for Microsoft to essentially use its nonprofit wings to shame its competitors like Palantir, as if Palantir is bad, but Microsoft is somehow noble. And so that's the kind of work we get from this corporate-backed academic discourse on AI. Okay, so just to conclude, and we can circle back to some of these topics later if there's time, AI, like white supremacy itself, is adapted to fit new times. That's a testament to the strengths of social movements on the one hand, and it's also a testament to the cleverness and to the clever rhetoric that this nonprofit industrial complex and the state and corporations come up with. And so even though the AI as a whole and the whole apparatus of it is still serving the same imperial and capitalist agendas, it comes in new forms. And That's why we get this proliferation of what I would call distractions about ethical AI, the bias of AI, algorithmic justice, algorithmic accountability, even though at the end of the day, AI doesn't throw someone in prison, the police does. And the violence comes from the institutions of our society and people who are in it, not from inert computational objects. And so these are all basically diversions and distractions, different labels for the same problematic structures. And so when you hear AI, I think it's good to ask, how is white supremacy sort of reshaping itself this time? So thank you. I hope I didn't go on too long.
Thank you, Yarden. That was definitely, very informative, and appreciate, just the directness, and and thank you for calling out the nonprofit industrial complex, the academia. So in a sense, also this whole issue of how we're looking at this artificial whiteness, that a nebulous, as you said, an idea, just kind of pulling out of there as a construct. To claim that supremacy as well. So I'm going to open it up real quickly to see if someone has a question of what we see before we go to Craig, and they can message me or raise their hand, or maybe we can hold the questions for later. So a lot there. So once again, thank you for your work. And the book that you've written, Artificial Whiteness. So Craig, listening to all of this, let's talk about it. Like, how are our folks on the street, and how do you think it's figuring in Skid Row, and what does it mean to folks?
Yeah, it's interesting that AI is kind of a nebulous term, as Mr. Katz points out, that as we as organizers see on the street every day in Skid Row and throughout the city, we see that over-policing, we see pseudosciences like predictive policing and hotspots and all these supposed abilities of computers to objectify policing and control. Well, to make a couple of points, 2 or 3 points of contextual analysis, I'd like to start with how we in the coalition became abolitionists, and that's from doing our work in the community. We in the coalition have become abolitionists because of the realization that the whole system of governance and control, including capitalism, is a body that is rotten to the core, a body which cannot be healed or recuperated, but only buried, i.e. abolished. And that the beating heart of this body is white supremacy. This view, and of course, puts us directly at odds with liberal reformers. And more specifically on the pseudoscience, of supposed objectivity, objective algorithms, predictive policing, and big data mining, all the information collected openly and secretly about us can be used to make us, meaning society, safer. This, of course, is the big lie. And the big lie is the bottom line. If you can believe this big lie, then you will believe that the police state is on your side, and you should be willing to sacrifice your human rights and freedoms if you believe the big lie that the police state is on your side, because they have objective algorithms, which is, of course, nonsense. The algorithms and programs in the computers are fed in by human beings with biases, so bias in and bias out. So what do? We organize against this idea, hence this webinar, to spread the truth. On AI, more specifically, as the latest and greatest of all pseudosciences, the coming age of artificial intelligence, meaning we are where we are now versus where we'll be soon. Where we are now is expert systems that are programmed, leading to, in the near future, supposedly, neural nets, which can program themselves through machine learning, and which will surpass the capacities of the human brain. If this is true, it is an obvious threat to human culture in general. But my point is that it will be first married to the power and purposes of those who develop it and promote it, i.e., male white supremacist power structures. We, the other, quote unquote, will be the guinea pigs that it will first be used on. And as an example for discussion, the example is, I would like to point out, in this use of AI on us first, will be the justice system and decisions within the justice system, where people will be prosecuted. I almost said persecuted, which would be a more apt term, will be prosecuted by decisions based on, quote unquote, objective artificial intelligence. And they'll be sentenced, once convicted under these terms, by standards and practices outlined by artificial intelligence. So I think the justice system will be the very first place. We already see it happening now, where artificial intelligence will be used to make decisions that would directly affect those of us who are considered the other. That's all minority and communities, as well as all poor people in general. Ahmed.
Thank you. Powerful. Thank you, Craig, for laying the groundwork. So question to both of you. I mean, is it too far-fetched to say then that, based on how Craig is, and this is a conversation, this is the thought that's coming from the ground up, that is it too far-fetched to say that AI is this new scientific or machine-based eugenics project? So I'd like each one of you to just is this the new form of eugenics that we are looking at, in a sense, which is being masked by this, and of course, just where, at the service to and for whom, and obviously there's so much money involved. Is that too far-fetched? Yarden, let's go with you first.
Well, no, I don't think it's far-fetched at all. I think it has a lot in common with eugenics in its view of, like, hierarchical, ordered view of humanity. A lot of eugenicists are flocking to this for that reason. A lot of the discourse coming out of these spheres is very much eugenicist. You have books like Life 3.0, which was a bestseller, which talks about how AI will make us all rich, and will make for fair judges. That's one of the main points. So again, reinforcing Craig's point that the justice system is always sort of one of the first places they go. Anyway, the title Life 3.0 is exactly meaning that the rise of these so-called intelligence machines will replace humans, which are Life 2.0, and Life 1.0 is bacteria. So you're always trying to order the natural world in that way. So I don't think it's far-fetched. I think it's important to understand, though, that even if those promises are bullshit about the capacities, it can still do real damage, as it has always done. And yeah, I mean, there's more to say about that, but basically, I don't think it's far-fetched. I think eugenics is exactly the right frame, and that's kind of where I was going by invoking the notion of a racial science. So I think it's an apt frame. It's, of course, not exactly the same as eugenics, because you don't have organized breeding of human beings and stuff like that. So, but.
Because by training, you're a biologist, correct?
Yeah. Yeah.
So did that have, just the human body, the biology, and did that have, some instructive moments for you, and kind of just look at AI as through this eugenics lens?
Oh, yeah, yeah, absolutely. Because biology, as we know, there was really no separation historically between genetics and eugenics. They
Right.
grew up at the same, they're the same discipline, essentially, the same major figures, the same statistical analysis techniques, and so forth. And that's where people pioneered these horribly racist notions of intelligence in the early 20th century. This is an interdisciplinary project, if you will, between statistics, which was originally a discipline that was in the service of eugenics, and biology. So AI is very much, I think, continuing that bad interdisciplinary tradition of computing and math with biology, because it is ultimately trying to tell us something about the worth of human beings in different human groups. And so AI is always tied to biology. It's not just about computers or whatever or processing data.
Mm-hmm. So Craig, what is for the longest time, obviously, and this thought just with my last comment with Yarden, made me think about like how the whole construct of IQ, the intelligence quotient, has been thrown at us, and how these various hierarchies of intelligence have been created. And here we are, so we've seen eugenics, we've seen this advent of, and obviously the bell curve, and social scientists have written extensively around it and claimed it, Charles Murray and various other people. So in a sense, how do we then bring this conversation to the communities, Craig, or is there a conversation going on about this?
Well, it's a great question, and it should, of course, be brought to the community through organizing and explaining to people its direct effect on their lives. But first, I'd like to totally agree with your point and Yarden's point about eugenics. It is not AI is not in the tradition of eugenics. It is merely a continuation of it. It's a direct continuation of the whole idea of hierarchical categories, IQs, intelligence connected to race and racial identity. The concept of racial identity itself, with there being one race, the human race, and ethnic groups divided into artificial ideas of race in order to promote the supremacy of one ethnic group. It's interesting to note that when we think of eugenics, we think of Nazi Germany in a broad populist cultural sense. But it is interesting to note that eugenics starts in American academia and then moves to the Nazis. But actually, the whole idea and concept started at the frontier of quote unquote frontier of science in American academia.
Thank you. So let's just open it up because we want to make this a free flow of conversation. And Nikhil, I know you have a comment. I think it may not be a bad idea if you could just ask it directly, and go ahead and unmute yourself, and please feel free to share your comment.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Hamid. Thank you both so much for your comments. I've really appreciated how enlightening they've been. I really appreciated your presentation, Yarden, and the critical analysis of the co-optations of social justice terms to describe like these neoliberal reframings of AI, like ethical AI, algorithmic injustice. And I totally see how terms such as decolonial or abolitionist AI may be the next phase of that. But I'm curious to hear whether those concepts can actually ever authentically exist in radical liberatory ways, and if so, how AI can authentically be repurposed as a tool for liberation and as like in a really radical future where it's like the sort of technological power is repatriated. Is that possible?
So that's a great question. So I think that because I would argue AI is not like a tool in the kind of liberal sense of it's not just like an instrument that has multiple uses. So we just pick the one that is liberatory. I think it's a kind of a set of connected ideologies that get their power from imperialist and capitalist structures and have always done so historically. And so I think that saying, we're going to have decolonial AI is a little bit like saying, we're going to have decolonial capitalism, or we're going to have, well, and people are saying stuff like that, like we're going to have radical markets, or, a free market that serves everyone. And then, it degenerates, and soon you have Elizabeth Warren. So I think we have to be really careful with that, especially when what I see is when people try to stick liberatory in front of some existing established apparatus. I often, what's missing for me is that historical analysis saying, what is this thing that you're trying to now reconfigure? What has it served historically, and how deep does the rot go? And without saying that, first, I'm always skeptical about the decolonial AI. And you see that corporations they just adore that term, because you can go to a conference and you can present a paper on abolitionist AI. You can be funded by Microsoft to do that work, and they'll love it as long as you don't question the basic sort of agenda and political economy of these companies. So you can't say, well, Microsoft is profiteering from agribusiness and, exerting colonial influence over farmers in, India, Brazil, et cetera. You can't say Microsoft is serving the Israeli army and giving its cloud platform to Israeli police. As long as you don't say that and you stay with these abstractions like decolonial AI, you can cite radical thinkers, you can cite Frantz Fanon, you can cite all these people, and it won't actually challenge their bottom line. If anything, it'll just enhance the progressive veneer that they're trying to build. So I think we have to be careful with that. And I think that groups like Stop LAPD Spying Coalition know that very pedestrian, ordinary practices of surveillance, like sharing databases between agencies or biometric data, that kind of ordinary practice is already harmful and dangerous. So you don't even need to invoke the supposedly magical capacities of AI for that. So I guess I'm more into doing the basic work of naming the structures, naming the violence, before we jump to like the liberatory, repurposing of that thing. Sorry for the long-winded answer.
Thank you. Go ahead, Charles, if you want to unmute yourself.
Great. Yeah, thanks, Hamid, and thanks, Yarden and Craig, for your fantastic presentations. By way of introduction, I'm a grad student at Caltech and an organizer with Socialists of Caltech. And a lot of our activity actually has to do with sort of direct actions targeting, recruiters that have extant sort of police and military ties, particularly in the tech sphere. And also, like Hamid, I appreciated that you drew the connection to eugenics in your sort of first set of questions, because another really active strand of our activity recently has been forcing a reckoning with Caltech's own very extensive, legacy in promoting eugenics. And so, yeah, I was vibing very hard basically with everything that y'all said. And yeah, I guess I sort of have one comment and one question. The comment is, it seems like a lot of the more sort of out there speculations about ethical AI or about the possibilities of a malevolent AI are coming out of the same place of sort of introspective white settler paranoia, as for example alien invasion narratives, where there's this idea that a superior being comes onto the scene, whether it's a more technologically sophisticated alien civilization, or an AI of our own creation that outstrips all of our abilities, and essentially puts people, right, which is to say what sort of the white settler establishment itself in the same position that they put colonized people under. You know, that seems to be like a common strand there. And you know, like from that standpoint, I find it very telling that like one of the main sort of funders of this kind of research into ethical AI is none other than Elon Musk, who, you know, whose inherited fortune was literally based on, you know, emerald mining in apartheid South Africa. And the question that I had, I guess, was inspired by one of your slides, Yarden, particularly the one about Timnit Gebru's work at Google, about sort of facial recognition, you know, algorithms and the sort of racial bias encoded therein, and sort of the limitations of that as a critique, right? You know, the fact that eliminating that bias would in fact be extending, you know, that kind of carceral gaze, or you know, expanding it, right, to, you know, specific demographics like Black women in particular. And I guess the question I had was, you know, Timnit Gebru's firing by Google recently was one of the main grievances cited in, you know, the announcement of the formation of the Alphabet Workers Union. And, you know, it was kind of like part of a long string of, you know, sort of labor actions at Google / Alphabet that, you know, had sort of, you know, an overall progressive kind of like social justice orientation to them, right? You know, earlier, I think they you know, were targeting like, you know, a DoD contract, for example, that Google was thinking of bidding for. But, you know, I guess my question for you is, do you think that there are sort of essential limitations to that model of like worker organizing within these big tech companies like Google? Like, do you think there's any place for like a more radical analysis that goes beyond the envelope of just, you know, sort of correcting biases or imposing sort of like, you know, regulations at some higher level, as opposed to sort of banning, you know, the use of certain technologies outright, or directly sort of fighting them, right, in a truly sort of you know, insurgent way, or do you think that there is, you know, at least the nucleus of some sort of like more radical potential in something like the Alphabet Workers Union?
Yeah, you're raising so many fantastic things. Just to say, you know, I agree with all of your first part about colonial narratives and the white fear of being relegated to the fate of colonized people, and all these tropes come up in AI discourses, and I tried to capture that in the book. To your point about Gebru and, you know, this so-called tech left, just a minor point. This was when Gebru was at Microsoft. It was before she went to Google, but I think it's not surprising that this kind of limited sort of bias framework would come out of that world, because it is the corporate academic sphere, and corporations generally don't fund their own demise, and like people who worked in that space, you know, share so much in form and in values with the companies that are sponsoring them. So it's, in that sense, it's not surprising. The question of organizing, I have to say, what I'm about to say is very much a minority view, and I get a lot of flack for it. So for what it's worth, I think this so-called tech left thing and the term tech worker is very misleading and has real limitations. And so first of all, let's begin with this term, you know, tech worker. For you, we're using tech, you know, so we're basically equating all of technology with this like very narrow set of, you know, computing practices that are very recent. Tech worker doesn't apply. A plumber is not a tech worker, even though, you know, I'd prefer to have a toilet than have some new app. Okay, so there's that issue, and then it masquerades as like, you know, tech worker is everyone from programmers who make 200K plus at Google, and apparently, you know, the cafeteria workers that are serving them, and the people who are annotating data in the Philippines for Facebook. And so it's basically trying to gloss over different class interests and lumping it all under this, you know, tech worker uprising. If you look at the actual work of these tech workers, some of it is good, you know, yeah, protesting a contract with the DoD, but the analysis is just like so naive. Google does so many other nefarious things that are far worse than, you know, Project Maven, and you single it out like it's some sort of exception, and then you make a big media buzz. A lot of the time, the corporation just, so they break Project Maven. So what? They do a bazillion other horrible things that are not even on the radar of these tech workers. As a labor project, I think it also has very many limitations, because some of these workers they're fighting for things like better intellectual property rights. And so, which they want as like better, as highly paid, programmers. And so I think it glosses over different class interests in a really problematic way with this kind of huge umbrella term tech worker. So I'm very skeptical of that. And again, when you look at some of these groups like Microsoft Workers for Good, they're calling for Microsoft to be a leader in corporate ethics. Okay, well, I'm not going to be on board with that, and I don't care if they get slightly better conditions as programmers or whatever, or they want to feel good by ending a Pentagon contract. I think there's real limitations there, I would say. And if I can just have another point, I think it's really important to think about the structures, the nonprofit structures and their limitations. So a lot of these nonprofits that are supposedly progressive and are involved in organizing these tech workers like AI Now, these are, corporate constructions, first of all, but they in many ways have all the worst features of the nonprofit industrial complex, meaning they're totally opaque and secretive. We don't know who gives the money, how much, and for what purposes really. Some of them are not even a 501c3. Not that 501c3 is something to aspire to, but you can't even do the basic testing. They have no community that they're accountable to, right? So they're the only people that they're accountable to are essentially their boards, which consist of elite, ruling class members who are members of these corporations, and their funders. And so you can't expect that world to generate something that is, liberatory, if I can use that term, because they're not accountable to anyone. They're not working on behalf of any community. They're not working from within a community, right? Their only concern really, or the way they're evaluated, is the production of reports and media buzz and so forth. So I think, part of the limitations of the critique come out of the flawed structure that they're in, these nonprofit structures.
Before I go to Jalen, I have a comment somebody made for Craig that let me just see where this comment went. So, in a sense, Craig, to summarize this, that whenever we listened about this talk about technology and about supposedly quote unquote progress, there is a complete absence in the sense of when these things are being developed, and many communities remain absolutely invisible, who are then on the receiving end of the violence of these technologies. So yeah, I mean, I think that's, I'm just kind of paraphrasing the comment, but do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I agree with that. And I agree with the idea that one of the problems with supposed quote unquote tech workers rising up within a company whose entire business model is surveillance capitalism, in which the person using the service is actually the product, because it's based on information about them, is a corporatization of a phenomenon we see at the street level in organizing all the time, where all of our information that's openly gathered or secretly gathered is aggregated to police state functions in order to control us. That's because, and that relates to AI in the sense that because AI and all of these technological solutions, quote unquote solutions, are really based on an ideology, the ideology of white supremacy, and maintaining order and control of the group which is in control now and has been in control for hundreds of years.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So I'm going to go to, let's see, where did Jalen go? Oh, there you are. Jalen, go ahead and unmute yourself.
Hello. Can you guys hear me?
Yes, please, go ahead.
Yeah, man. Just guys, again, thank you again. As African American, I'm here in Roanoke, Virginia, in a very large African American community, and hearing these things, and of course, we read about data, and it obviously, how I'm hearing this is, our data is being sold to help, educate these future AIs, and if I'm on the right track, how do we, as a community, get power, get control over our data? I guess that's the sense I'm trying to go into, because how do we control our data, especially with these narratives of how they're trying to educate these AI, if I'm on the right track?
Craig, you want to take a shot at that first?
Yeah, the question becomes, can we control our data if it's being mined constantly and aggregated to police systems and control systems? The way that we can fight against it is by being aware of the ability of the aggregators or the police systems to get a hold of our information, so that we can take steps to block some or all of the collection of the data. That's the only thing that can be done, because in effect, once they have the data, we know what they will do with it. Hamid, you want to comment on that?
Oh, I have much to say about that. I mean, I think because quite frankly, almost kind of on this as data abolitionists, pretty much, or almost data abolitionists, I think for Stop LAPD Spying Coalition, the question really becomes that where is our fight? Because ultimately, data becomes representative of the communities rather than the community's real history and their own stories, which should be the real truth. So I think we continue to end up, and not to say that the coalition has not used data to prove a point as well, to drive a point home. But I think the datification of our lives, that we have become so sort of absorbed by that, there's a presumption that only if we control our own data, things can change. Only if we were in charge, things can change. And maybe in a minute, I'll show about the graph that we have, the stalker state, by which we even feel that, that it's not even mathematically possible to do that. So, where even with everything else, and I'm reminded by Jamie as well about this whole thing about techno-solutionism, that we are constantly looking for techno-solutionism, and I think this is something that we need to really be fighting back as well.
Great point.
Yeah, so I am going to go to Khadija, Khadija, go ahead and unmute yourself.
Hi, Hamid. Thank you so much for giving me a chance to answer a question. I've really enjoyed listening to this. And one of the reasons I thought that this call was so important, and shout out to Alejandro for inviting me, is because these socio-technical systems really are not legible to the broader community that's trying to do social justice work. And I really loved what the algorithm ecology, I can hear myself talking. Is that everybody? Or that's just me?
No, you're good.
See if I take off my headphones. I really love the algorithmic ecology that Free Radicals and Stop LAPD Spying did when they were using Predpol, and they were predicting that hotspots would be within Skid Row, and then found that it was on the outer perimeter, because you're seeing new forms of enclosure. Because a lot of times, if you're somebody that's experiencing state violence through policing or through human services, child services, like algorithms can feel very abstract. And a lot of these systems are visibilized in the way that Yarden indicated in the beginning, similar to white supremacy. But I just want to complicate this narrative a little bit, because I think sometimes when something is new, the way that like discourses travel through one domain to another, it can seem like there's like this very authoritative narrative. And I just think that a lot of these things are very complicated, and sometimes it's hard to parse when we begin from the ideology. And I really think that where this conversation, just in general, like our communities need to go, is to understand how these technical systems on the level of like infrastructure affordances are even reproducing these kind of forms of ideology and new modes of social control and surveillance. And I just wanted to say about the tech worker organizing, I think there's a huge problem with the funding structure, and I'm very happy to call out the neoliberalism. And I have very similar concerns about like the Gender Shades Project and the idea that the problem with facial recognition is that it's not accurate at predicting Black faces, and therefore we should make it better, able to predict Black faces. I think that's really problematic. But on the flip side, I guess maybe I'm more optimistic about tech worker organizing, because while like the political radicalism of tech engineers who are getting 250 to 500,000 plus salaries annually might be bounded, I think that the idea with the alphabet unionizing whatever its limitations in practice are coming from not necessarily worried about their own precarity, but figuring out how do we actually mitigate the harms of these technologies. And Google's doing lots of terrible things, but if we are complicit in making autonomous weapons, that is terrible. And I think we can look at things like Mi Gente's No Tech for ICE project and see when it has been really successful at pushing people to cease and desist. But I think that the biggest limitations to those conversations is that ultimately a true radical grassroots movement is not going to come from within, upper middle class computer science engineers. But the only way to have that real solidarity is that there has to be much more dialogue, not just about the downstream effects of these technologies, but how these technologies actually work. And I think that the question that you asked about data, Hamid, is an important one. But I think that even getting more basic than that, like how is this data even getting collected? What is the data that we want to have? What are the systems that we have the right to refuse? And then how do we actually see these systems? Because if there was a brick and mortar wall that went to surround the perimeter of Skid Row, people would riot. And because it's algorithms, because it's something that's more visibilized, there's not the same resistance. So anyway, that was like a series of thoughts, but I just wanted to share that to kind of think about.
Thank you, Khadija, for that comment. So also have a question, and I believe that you sort of addressed that around the Project Maven, but from Kyle, that how do you, for Yarden, that how do you read Google employees walking out for Project Maven? Can someone ethically do machine learning research in the context of a company like Google?
Yeah, well, I just want to say I agree with many of the things that Khadija said, and I have an issue with the premise of the question, because it's like putting it at the level of an individual. Can somebody be ethical while working at Google? I think anybody who's working for a corporation or a university. I work for Harvard, which is like one of the is more evil than Google, probably, because it's been around much longer and it's done far worse things. So people who work in these spaces are all compromised to varying degrees, of course, not exactly the same. And like, there's no way to be a pure individual in those settings, I believe. And so the question is, how do you organize? How do you build power? And, the inspiring moves in that space are done by groups like this one, building power, doing the political education, trying to understand how these things work at a technical level and an ideological level. I just want to say, and this is returning to the point about like so-called, decolonial AI or abolitionist AI and whether that's possible. I think that, the field of computing in general is so suffused with propaganda, like almost every term, not just artificial intelligence, but like cloud computing. Cloud computing really refers to like things that are underground, like, so I think there's a lot of really basic thinking that needs to be done about not just what data we want to collect, like or need, like the questions Hamid raised, but also what is computation anyway, and do we want it, and should it even exist, and if so, in what form, and can it exist in a form that is like ecologically sustainable and like consistent with the vision of caring for the earth. And so these are really deep, hard questions, and some people are sort of making gestures in that direction and trying to understand the radical implications. Like in some sense, computers are things that shouldn't exist, because if you look at the whole pipeline of their production, it's dependent on so many horrible ecological processes, not to even mention the labor exploitation. So I think that we're, we're kind of far away from this serious thought, because a lot of these structures, the nonprofit industrial complex, all these things, the obfuscation, the propaganda get in the way of that, which is why I'm so hesitant to jump to sort of like the decolonial AI or the liberatory this or the liberatory that. And, I think it's too far away, and there's a lot of serious thinking that needs to be done, and conversations like these, and we need more spaces for that.
Thank you. So we have a couple more questions. Keep on coming, folks. Before I go to Pancake, Brother Pancake, there's this question, and Craig, it's about that. It's from Devon or Devon. I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. Excuse me if I'm not. My bad. Your take on the Hollywoodization of AI, and then how has that, just creates this whole a different universe, and the sensationalism behind it, and the impact of that on our communities, and how people didn't kind of buy in. So how do you see that, Craig?
Well, the Hollywoodization of is, as Yarden pointed out, is basically part of the propaganda. It's the propaganda narrative of whether or not they want to scare you to death with the coming AI revolution, or whether they want to lull you into acceptance of something that will be beneficial by them surveilling you 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. It's what movies and the propaganda that they put out about AI is merely conditioning, in my opinion, for what's coming. And you can be conditioned negatively or positively, but it all comes down to getting you to think, if you have a negative view of AI, getting you to think in terms of reformist terms, being able to tame it and make it work better for the society as a whole. When in reality, the problem with AI and the problem with all these surveillance capitalism systems like Google and Microsoft is that what we need is abolition. And the reason it's got to come mostly from the outside is because these tech workers, quote unquote, inside the companies are not going to jeopardize their $200,000 a year jobs in order to stop the harm that AI can do to the entire society and the entire world, in my opinion.
Thank you. Thank you. We have
I totally agree with that.
Thank you. Have a comment from Brother Pancake. No, wait, I just saw Pancake on the screen. Let me see if I can. Sorry, Devon, I was trying to unmute you previously too, but couldn't. So let's try Pancake. Can you unmute yourself? And I know you had a question about for Yarden.
I will. Can you hear me?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, go ahead.
Yarden, my friend, you majored in biology. What's your take on biodata? Because I'm understanding that data collected, like DNA, so forth and so on, can be used as a weapon, if you know what I mean. Comment on that biodata.
Yeah, no, that's a great point, and it relates to what I was trying to say earlier, that sometimes really simple data collection can be very dangerous. So you can collect, for example, biometric data about people at the U.S.-Mexico border, and you can use that to jeopardize their lives, to prevent them from gaining entry. So this is a really important issue. And now we have this proliferation of these ancestry testing things that are being heavily marketed, and they're very misleading. They don't really tell you like what they're saying they're going to tell you. They're not going to tell you the historical migration history of your family or anything like that. But once they have that genetic signature of you, they can place you within, and connect you to all these other systems of surveillance. So there was a study that showed that, if you have a sample from someone's Y chromosome and you just know the state that they live in, you can narrow them down to like one of two people. So this biometric surveillance and genetic data collection is really terrifying, and it's terrifying precisely because it's such a consumer commodity now. Everybody's doing these genetic tests, not knowing the implications. So companies like 23andMe and all that. And it's based on snake oil because they're promising you they're going to unravel your family history of migration, but it's really very problematic.
Pancake, if you want to unmute, do you have a follow-up question?
I just made a comment about, you kind of made a statement, IQ versus AI. It's very scary, and I look at HR, like sci-fi, robots replacing humans, and it's a trip, man. And it's good to shed light on what artificial intelligence is all about. It really does. So I appreciate your take on all this. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right.
Okay, but Jamie, you had a question. Go ahead and unmute yourself. You've unmuted.
Yeah, sorry, I was late to this conversation. Super awesome and really appreciate it. So, I had another question, just the take on genomic surveillance and kind of the technological solutions that are being sensationalized and propagated by, internationally, nationally, the WHO in regards to containment of the pandemic right now. And looking at these large infrastructures that are being built with like de-identified data in regards to, trying to identify variants of the COVID virus. So just kind of wanted to get your take on that, because we're kind of looking at that and the expansion of water waste surveillance and digital surveillance and sensory data that they're using and trying to build this out, even though I don't think they're probably going to be, they're not that great at it.
Sorry, it got cut off for me. Okay.
Yeah, go ahead, Jamie. But you froze there for a second.
Am I back?
Yeah, you're back.
Okay, great. So, and then just thinking about that, because I'm a nurse, so it's interesting how this is being very like the solution, right? Contain, control the virus, very state kind of punitive way to go about things. And it obfuscates the whole fact that the real resolution of the pandemic comes from what social justice movements have always been saying, housing, food, bread, water, like that's what we need to be safe. So I don't know if you've looked a little bit into that, but I'd be interested to just hear Craig, your thoughts, and then your thoughts as well, Yarden. Thank you.
Craig?
Yeah. Yeah. Jamie, as always, makes a great point that the real solution to these pandemics and the one that's happening now, as well as the ones that will happen in the future, is mediation of poverty. Stopping homelessness, stopping food deprivation, and organizing in order to get more control of our own narrative as well as our own data, and empowering the people at the grassroots or street level to do what is necessary to protect themselves. Parenthetically, I'd like to mention that on Pancake's point about DNA, it is interesting to note that not only, as Yarden points out, is DNA used as a tracking tool, but they're also developing, the military-industrial complex and academia is developing the potentiality for, and I mean right now, the potentiality for specific DNA to be targeted by biological weapons.
Yarden?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with what Jamie said about what's needed. You kind of froze for a minute, so I'm not sure I understood the connection, the point about surveillance and COVID, if I heard correctly. So maybe you can say a little bit more about that. Otherwise, I mean, I agree with the rest of what you said, and I don't have much to add to that.
Jamie, do you want to follow up with that real quickly?
Yeah, I mean, if it's okay, sorry about freezing. So no, because it's just what's being established right now is genomic surveillance, right, and vaccination, right. So they kind of together are establishing borders and boundaries and kind of identifying data of locale. The de-identified data that comes from the person that they collect the virus sample from is all metadata of location, you know, gender, you know, basic stuff like that of where
Sure.
you're at and who you are. And then that's being shared through state databases, through public health, and then into national databases with the CDC, probably with the HHS, probably with DHS, and then also being shared internationally with the GSAD kind of database that's being established where they're encouraging countries to upload this information. So just,
Right.
and one reason why I thought about it is because you started speaking about how DNA data is identifying locality of people. And so there's always this move that de-identified data in medicine is somehow protecting people, which I already kind of, the suspicions just being, you know, so I've been in the coalition for so long. No, not that. That's not the case. So
Right.
not only is it like creating this space for the national securities police state to kind of expand and have more information to legitimize its containing of you, but it's like the sensationalized like solution. Like if we just amp this up, the pandemic will go away. When like just like Craig was saying, like nah, like we need housing, that we need people in shelter, we need people to be able to shelter in place. And so I just don't know if folks are talking about this right now in the landscape right now.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. And I mean, I've been following a very extreme version of this. It's happening in Israel and Palestine, where, you know, Israel made a deal with Pfizer to get the vaccine, of course, only for the Jewish population, not for Palestinians. In exchange, they agreed to give all the data. And I think that's, you know, metadata that's going far beyond probably what's being collected by other countries, because, you know, national security state in Israel is very, very strong, and they've passed laws saying that they can, if somebody's been identified as COVID positive, they can tap into their phone and extract other things as well. So, I mean, the danger is there, as you mentioned it. And if you start, you know, to have this kind of interoperability with other databases, that's a problem too. And, you know, again, about housing, nutrition, I mean, there's all this medical work on how nutrition, good nutrition state is one of the key determinants of susceptibility to infections of all kinds. And people forget that. And I think that now there's a lot of like tech solutionism around vaccines. I mean, vaccines are great. People should take vaccines. But, you know, there's a rise in pandemics over the recent decades coming out of rapid industrialization and other processes. And so you can't just like engineer your way out of it every time with like, here's a vaccine. And of course, vaccines come with like medical apartheid, as we're seeing in Palestine and other places. You know, some countries, I have friends in Algeria, they're not going to get the vaccine until whatever, 2024. I mean, it's horrible. It's like talking about eugenics. I mean, that's exactly that. Who's going to live and who's going to die.
Right. Thank you. Chela, go ahead and unmute yourself.
Yeah, and on top of that, Jamie, I loved what you said. I love you. Hi, Jamie. And hey, Craig. Yeah, I just what y'all both were kind of talking about, and what shit, I forgot the black film that was just on a few like comments ago. We're talking on. I also live in Skid Row, and I've been a part of Stop LAPD Spying. So a lot of my issues stem from like information sharing, right? Like the information sharing that like I've had to deal with, and that Craig, I'm sure you've had to deal with in your building, where we have social workers who sometimes share certain things with certain, like one of the very first things you sign when you get housing, that's government, is like a permission to share your medical and mental history, right? And so I'm also thinking about that, and also that along with as soon as Jamie started talking about it, it made me think of, thank you, the vulnerability index, which is this big ass system that the county of LA uses to determine, quote unquote, who needs a home, pretty much, who needs a home faster. And it's like, no, y'all not. Y'all just trying to like fucking surveil us and like figure this shit out and like, you know, come up with new tactics to kill us. So I was just gonna say that to and add that to your point, Jamie. That's all I wanted to say.
Thank you, Chella. Definitely a great point. So, so that we're gonna wrap this part of our for today's webinar. But before we do that, I just want to open it up for both Yarden and Craig for any closing comments. But before we do that, I just want to read a comment from Tom Tech that this centralized society allows this technology and the fascism it supports to run rampant. Equality will come with decentralization, and it helps to disable their ability to control people with technology. It doesn't create equality, it will allow it if we work toward it. Thank you for that comment. I want to thank both Yarden and Craig for really kind of just just having this awesome conversation. But before we let you all go, and you're welcome to stay for the rest of it because we want to speak about what happened today. Out there with the lawsuit and everything else, and I'm going to pass it on to Shakir in a minute. But Yarden and Craig, I know you got to rush out, but any closing comment from you?
Yeah, I wanted to ask Yarden a question, if that's possible.
Sure, please go ahead.
Yeah, my question was basically, has there been, about your book, has there been any pushback from other academics or reviewers or feedback from readers about them saying that your history of the development of artificial intelligence may be correct, but are they pushing back and saying by any chance that they don't accept the idea that it's somehow white?
The pushback that I've gotten is some of that, but also, I would share this with this group. I wouldn't say it publicly yet. Has been from these corporate-backed think tanks that are supposedly progressive, like AI Now, accusing me of defamation, and they've written to my publishers, to my editors who published my book, saying this is defamatory and trying to bully them into stopping the book from being published. So because the screenshots were leaked to them. So I've gotten that kind of pushback from people who depend on having their progressive reputation being, untainted so that they can raise a lot of grants and, maneuver this nonprofit industrial world. And then, some people say, whiteness and AI, what are you talking about? This is a technological force. I mean, there's a lot of that. I've gotten a lot of that. Yeah, for sure. And what is whiteness anyway? Whiteness is just something some, pinko commies made up.
Yeah, I can imagine you've been characterized as a extremist leftist, right?
That would be a nice term.
Nice. Yarden, any other thought you want to?
No, I'm just really thankful for the work that you do. As I said, I find it so inspiring. I'm thankful for this conversation. I admire what you do, and I think that really practicing abolition and an abolitionist process is really desperately needed in general, and especially in this space. So I'm grateful to you, and I learned so much from your work. So keep doing it. Don't cave in.
Thank you.
I know you won't.
No, we're all. Are you kidding me? Like just there's people that we see on the screen that they're all fierce. So so absolutely. But thank you for making the time and enlightening us. So today we've actually filed a lawsuit against the Los Angeles Police Department and the city of Los Angeles. And I'm going to pass it on to Shakir, my comrade, and who's also one of the attorneys on our legal team as well. But Shakir, go ahead. Do you want to talk about that? And also, if you want to talk about some of the defund surveillance demands. Oh, wait a minute. Let me just see. Hold on. Give me 1 second. There you go. There you are. Okay. Now go ahead. Unmute yourself.
Cool. Thanks. Yeah. And yeah, thank you, Craig and Yarden, for that. All of that. That was amazing. I learned a lot, and I've been taking a lot of notes. So we filed a lawsuit. The coalition has been for many months trying to research the details of LAPD's budget and the budget process. LAPD's budget is over $3.1 billion. And as we know, a lot of that money is paying for mass surveillance, for weapons, for other forms of harm and kind of tools used to stalk, monitor, gather data on our communities. But we know that broadly, but we don't know the details of all everything they spend money on. So we have been requesting, in particular, so every year LAPD asks for a new budget increase that they take like the previous year's spending, and then they show up and say we want 100 million more on top of that. They provide some explanation of the 100 million or whatever that they're trying to add, but they never provide any kind of itemized accounting of that full amount. So every year the budget just kind of snowballs, getting bigger and bigger, and without any kind of access to records of that full budget, the community has very limited ability to fight back and oppose that, and to also just talk about the harms of these programs. So we've been working to expose that. We've also been working from a perspective of recognizing that, when we're talking about the budget, we're not just calling for a more cost-effective or efficient policing. We're not just saying, get rid of the wasteful or excessive spending. We recognize that sometimes even some of the cheapest things in the budget can be the most harmful, and that surveillance is actually a tool, and all of the kind of predictive analytics and other surveillance tools that LAPD uses, they've adopted them probably in a frame of this is going to make us more cost effective and more efficient, and that might well be true in that they're able to do more with less, but that's exactly the problem, that these tools are multiplying the harm and the costs of policing in our communities. So we've been trying to get these records to find that out. LAPD has been turning away our requests. We've tried to get them from the controller, tried to get them from the city administrative office. Every agency just says, go try the other one. So after all that, the coalition filed a public records lawsuit today to demand that the city turn over those records, and explaining that, yeah, they're public records, that LAPD is violating its public records obligations around. So that lawsuit was filed today, and if people have questions about that, I can talk about that. But I also wanted to share, at the same time as the lawsuit, we're also launching, so this campaign that we've been working on to research and dissect the budget has been, along with our partners, Free Radicals, which is an organization of many it's sort of scientists and researchers who are kind of confronting the intersection of science and justice, and thinking about the limitations of thinking about science as objective. So they've been really, really awesome comrades in analyzing and exposing the budget with us. So we at the same time that we did this lawsuit, we also yesterday announced a set of demands that we've been working on for a while, and the demands focus on they're within the broader calls to defund the police, and led by in LA, BLM LA, and the People's Budget LA, those groups that have been doing kind of a their own advocacy around the budget, and especially a participatory budget process to ask the community how we want our money to be spent. And so our defund surveillance campaign kind of adds to that with a set of demands that are focused on the harm, not just the costs financially, but the costs to our lives in our communities of LAPD spending on surveillance, technology, and community policing. So we have a set of 7 demands here. The first one is to defund and disarm LAPD of all weapons of surveillance. The next is confronting the fact that LAPD, in addition to the $3.1 billion that they get from the city directly as their budget, they also take hundreds of millions more dollars from the budgets of other departments like library services, homelessness, kind of as providing policing on behalf of those agencies. And so in addition to taking that money, they're also siphoning data from other agencies that are providing services. Another is to confront federal spending on LAPD. And this demand I just want to highlight because, you know, we're talking about shrinking the LAPD budget and shrinking how much the city is spending on policing, but that doesn't mean, you know, that frame can often lead to thinking about external funding sources as actually good because, you know, it's not our city taxpayer dollars. But federal spending on LAPD is a real driver of a lot of the innovation, a lot of the experimentation that the police have done, including with predictive policing, including with different community policing initiatives, all kinds of counterterrorism policing initiatives. So we're also demanding that City Council stop accepting all of that DOJ and federal funding. Next is about the Community Safety Partnerships Program, which is a community policing initiative that has been around for about a decade and was expanded this summer. Kind of the city used the uprising as a way to kind of, you know, announce that, okay, in response, we're going to be expanding this community safety, this community policing initiative beyond just a kind of experiment to a whole bureau. And so the problems with community safety partnerships is one, that it's a form of surveillance, that it's embedding police in targeted communities where they're collecting data, they're mapping kind of community networks, who knows who, they're kind of getting close to a lot of social service providers and other groups. In that way, it's kind of a form of counterinsurgency is the way we think about it, that they are inserting themselves into trying to pacify kind of dissent or questioning of the police. They're kind of propping up the idea that everything that these communities get are going to come through policing. And so specifically in that way, you know, even funds and resources that could be going to community services or social programs are being kind of earmarked for social programs, but delivered by LAPD as the provider of those programs. And most of that funding for that actually is but then just paying for LAPD officers to be in communities, surveilling them and infiltrating and causing harm, doing kind of, you know, broken windows, quality of life arrests, just doing what they do all the time. The next is taking on LAPD's propaganda units. So LAPD has this public communications group which is, you know, spans a bunch of different units, and their job is basically to spread lies and to, you know, criticize people who are critical of police, to criticize often victims of LAPD violence. They're quick to be, you know, telling the media things about the record or whatever past stuff about someone who's been killed by police, you know, far more quickly than we know about. When a police killing happens, we will often know very little about the police who did it or really what happened, but we'll really quickly know about, you know, the person's record or something that someone in their family did. And so we're calling to abolish those units and, you know, that they should have no money. The next is taking on the Police Commission, which is the civilian oversight board of the LAPD, which is an absolutely useless body that sits to primarily just rubber stamp everything that the police want to do. Even this budget process, the fight that we've been having around the budget has been a real illustration of that. The budget was released like late on a Friday night, and when it came out, LAPD actually had characterized it as this is this New Year's budget that they proposed in November. Even though that budget is a $106 million increase over last year, they tried to characterize it as a $29 million reduction just by kind of moving around numbers. The community brought that to the attention of the police commission, mobilized, asked the police commission to at least just delay the vote on it. But just 2 days after the budget went to the police commission, they voted to approve it. And that's, again, it's the largest budget. It's the largest police budget in city history. And there was, after everything this summer, after, in a moment when the city is facing record revenue shortfalls, I think $750 million revenue shortfall, the police commission just votes this thing through. So ending this body is crucial to taking on the rest of the violence that LAPD is driving in our city. And finally, it's this is, and I think this is an example of, like, similar to the other ones, where we're talking about the budget, but we're thinking not just about the budget document, not just about the flow of money from city council to LAPD, but all the ways that LAPD spending and surveillance and policing are kind of expand with time. And a big part of that is tech industry and academic collaboration, which is something we've been talking about a lot today. So all these companies, and Microsoft is an example that we have here, we're quick to put out these statements, standing in solidarity with racial justice movements and with protesters. They also tried to pull these PR stunts of, for example, like Yarden was talking about, saying that they're gonna not sell any facial recognition to police for a year, or until the regulations are in place, regulations that, because they're kind of shaping and are able to be responsive to, are really just a way to weed out their competitors, particularly with facial recognition. At the same time, they're also selling, all kinds of more mundane or routine types of tools to police. When we think about the harm that policing is causing, like high-tech surveillance, machine learning, algorithms are a part of it, but the sort of a much bigger part of the infrastructure is just the records management systems. It's the tools that LAPD uses to just even collect field interviews and feed them into their systems. And so that entire technological infrastructure has existed for a really, really long time. And just simply focusing on the Palantir or the facial recognition is missing the much broader and deeper and much more harmful role that a lot of these Microsoft, IBM, HP, Motorola, these companies have. Likewise for academic institutions, a lot of LAPD's kind of worst experiments and most harmful practices were developed as research or studies with academic institutions that includes academic research into the community safety partnerships program as seeing the efficacy of this community policing program, or research into to verifying or promoting LAPD's predictive policing initiatives. So this academic complicity is deep, and it shows up in a lot of different forms. There's the research, there's vouching, there's just even like kind of legitimizing the concepts and ideologies of predictive policing. And so we're calling on these institutions that kind of pretend to stand with communities to actually do that and end their complicity with police. So yeah,
Thank you, Shakir.
Any questions or comments either about the demands or the lawsuit?
If anybody has any thoughts, any comments, any questions? A lot of appreciation. Well, thank you. Cool. Yeah, Tom, go ahead. I hear you want to unmute. Go ahead, try to unmute.
All right. So my whole thing in this, at this point, for the public, I think it's really important to show people what the alternatives are. They're thinking we're just going to shut down all this money to the police department and everyone's going to run rampant. I know it's ridiculous. I know it's garbage. But the point is that still needs to be pushed against. And you need to turn around and say, no, we got better uses for the money, and these uses are, and go over it in that direction.
Thank you. Thank you, Tom. Felicity, go ahead and try to unmute.
Thank you.
Yes.
Yeah, we're working on a people's budget, Orange County, and also trying to get, some of the, I think it's 67% of the county budget in Orange County goes to social control. And we did we did a survey and to ask the people what their priorities were and are, and it came back, you know, they would rather have 60% going to different community services, healthcare, mental health experts, et cetera, and something, you know, under 15% going to. So I'm really interested in this, the slideshow you just presented. It's really complete. Can we find it on, is there a website or is it on the Stop LAPD Spying website?
Yeah, no, it is on a website. It's just defundsurveillance.org. I'll post the link in the chat too, but yeah, that's where our demands are, and also, yeah, the campaign.
That's great. Thanks so much. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other question? We just have one more thing to share, but cool. Well, thank you, Shakir. And we're going to keep folks posted as things progress as to where things are. But there's a dedicated group that meets every Sunday at 4 o'clock, the Stop LAPD Spying and our partners, Free Radicals, looking at this defund surveillance, doing a deep dive, and, you know, just in a sense that how do you starve the beast? How do you take their money away? And how do you kind of just take their resources? The next, I wanted to really quickly go that, and this conversation came out that many a times people have talked to us about digital security and about infiltration and in a sense, just like as these meetings are always open, we don't ask people to register, of course, like because of Zoom bombing, trying to keep, making sure that the integrity of the conversation is there and we're respectful of folks. Similarly, we've always had open door which was always our in-person meeting in Skid Row at LA Can's Freedom Room. So in a sense, we had a conversation and people have asked us, like, you know, so what are the best ways that you engage in digital security? And we were like, we don't really. We still use Google Docs, we use Gmail. I mean, these are just modes of communication. Yes, these are all evil companies and all of that, but yet at the same time, like, you know, okay, until we are able to, and the goal really is to make sure that everybody is accessible, so we don't get into these high-tech sort of like, you know, just PGPs, and none of us, I don't even know what that means, of people having their own keys and everything else. But what we do very clearly is what are our values and what are our principles, and how do we uphold those principles, and what does it mean to us? So we wanted to then, with much love and so much respect for baby anarchists who are, and some of the folks are part of our coordinating team as well. So today we're releasing a zine on our grassroots principles, and this is, and I'm going to post this link on the website in chat as well. So it's both printable version and online version as well. So this is so these grassroots self-defense principles, a bunch of organizations and individuals, this was a labor of a whole folks coming together. This was back in January of 2017. And so we posted that on our website, and now we have a zine. So we will be popularizing these as well and turn this into a pop-ed material. So starting off with Asada, that is Asada's call to us and challenge to all of us. The first thing being that grassroots community self-defense is a labor of love. It's about collective liberation. It's principles grounded in collective liberation. The power is within our communities, and it's not with state and federal government or profit-driven war and warmongering corporations. That's another one of our principles as well. An injury to one is an injury to all, that we shall not tolerate any abuse, oppression, or repression. We must fight together with marginalized communities to abolish all systems of oppression. Then moving on to fundamental needs and rights, from the land to the people. Every being has fundamental needs and rights. We honor the sacredness of life when we fight to ensure everyone's basic necessities are met. Our struggles are interconnected. We collectively recognize that movements centered around race, class, gender, sexuality, nation, and disability are inseparable and intertwined. Our struggles against racism in the US are inherently connected to liberation movements around the world, such as the struggle against Zionist apartheid and genocide of the Palestinian people. We have commitment to Black liberation, that we must confront our personal and our community's anti-Blackness in the fight for Black liberation. Commitment to trans, femme, gender nonconforming, and LGBTIQ liberation. We must confront our personal and our community's homophobia, transphobia, anti-LGBTIQ sentiments, and hateful and harmful policies. Commitment to land recognition, that everyone in LA area lives in Tongva, Gabriela, and Chumash land. That we are migrants, refugees, diasporic, displaced, and enslaved people. We respect, acknowledge, and join the fight by Native peoples to preserve their land and its resources in so-called LA and beyond. Commitment to support and fund community defense and building a culture of resistance, that we will engage in collective learning with our communities about the state apparatus for surveillance. And then, of course, ACAB. Hold nonprofit groups accountable, and there was a lot of conversation about that just now as well, that how do we shall call on our communities to hold nonprofit groups and foundations and social justice and community-based orgs accountable, quit co-opting our movements, organize to resist and defeat fascism, colonialism, imperialism, capitalism, and genocide. We're committed to organizing from a perspective that understands the systemic oppression. Commitment to internal struggle and transparency, that we shall strive on an ongoing basis to identify any contradictions within the various collaborating groups. Commitment to assess our language, that we shall build power within our movements and communities by assessing and evaluating our languages and challenging them. And then operational unity amongst collaborating groups, that we are committed to working together and creating affinity groups that share our principles and concerns to create a common front in defending our communities and love is principled. So wanted to share this, and I'm going to post the link in chat for folks to pull up and see if there was any thoughts. And Shakir, Jamie, anything you all want to add to that? I don't know, because you all have been a part of creating those and being an active part of that. So anything? Jamie, I'm just going to make you co-host and see if you have any thoughts, because you've been a part of this back since the 2017 framing of these things and looking at the zine.
It looks so beautiful to see it, see all that brought to life. And I was just thinking about where we were during that time. And I think one thing I just want to say is that I think the importance of the fact that that document was very text heavy. And a lot of times, we're taught to, that's the most dominant form of communication is like the written word, right? But the images that the baby anarchist added to this has really brought in a whole lot of love. Like, hate to be a bad Led Zeppelin song, but it is like really demonstrates that these principles are really based in kind of love and care and concern and want for growth of everybody. So I really am glad that we took this extra step and that we turned this into a zine. I feel like it has just brought so much life and makes, kind of sometimes, what's the word, like complicated statements, just very simple. And I think that's and not trying to like de-intellectualize things, but I think that what we are asking for is always like very simple, and it's very obvious, and it always gets like kind of like a pushback that it's too complicated, it's too much, like what you're saying is it's just you're going off on the deep end. What do you think? So I really appreciate this a lot, and it's interesting now that we are releasing it again in the context of Biden, where there's so much kind of illusion that's happening right now of, who he is and what he can do. And I think what this is reminding us is about our power and all the power that's been built, and the fact that we have to believe in that grassroots power to further make things change. And it just reminds me of a conversation I was having with a nurse, and she was like, well, look at all the stuff he did, you know, right when he came into office. And I was like, you think he did that shit because he wanted to? Like, he did that stuff because people have been organizing, you know, and people have been doing it for decades. And, you know, his hand was forced. You know, this wasn't because he's benevolent and nice and kind. Anyways, just, yeah, it's awesome. It's such a great Valentine, I should say. Belated Valentine. I think that's great.
Anybody else has any thoughts, any comments about that? Thank you. We need to simplify knowledge for the general public. Definitely, definitely. Any other thoughts? Cool. Well, that brings us to the end of our third Tuesday webinar. Sydney, you wanted to get some information. I just posted Pre-Rad's handles if you want to message them. I don't have their website handy right now, so maybe they'll be able to respond through that, or I can just email it to you later. But thank you all very much. This was really an awesome conversation. Much appreciated. The recording is going to be up on the website hopefully by Friday or so. And then stay tuned, because our next Tuesday, fourth Tuesday of the month, meeting is going to be on data-driven policing. So that's where, you know, we're going to be having we're going to be having more conversations about where we are going with all this language around predictive analytics and AI and machine learning, but how this really plays on the ground, and what is it about, like, you know, just control of land and banishment of people, and how policing is taking on this whole pseudoscience and veneer of science to mask their racial violence and their structural violence and the institutional violence. But with that, I want to thank you all again for joining us, and stay tuned, and we look forward to seeing you all. So the information on the webinar would be on the website, Tom, stoplapdspying.org. So you can always go there, and that's going to be for the webinar. The information is going to be there, hopefully by Saturday. Okay. So thank you all very much, and look forward to seeing you next Tuesday. Have a good night and be safe. Bye-bye.